The sky was barely more than ash when Serafina stepped onto the path. Morning mist clung to the earth like breath not yet exhaled, curling around her ankles as if trying to draw her back. Her red gown, once crisp and carefully pressed, hung wet and wrinkled, torn at the hem and stained dark with forest soil. The small black satchel she'd sewn by moonlight now pressed against her chest like a shield. She'd spent weeks preparing for the mating ceremony, stitching, polishing, hoping, imagining how she might look among the others, not radiant perhaps, but at least worthy of being seen. She never made it. Instead, she'd knelt in the dirt for hours, digging, lifting, straining. Her arms still shook from the weight of the timber she'd pulled away from the stranger's crushed chest. She hadn't even asked his name. There hadn't been time. Now the drums were silent, the fires out. The village, already beginning its slow stirring, offered no welcome as she passed. Just stares, just silence. And then, him. He stepped out of the fog like something conjured, bare-chested, battle-scarred, his long, dark braids falling across powerful shoulders, his eyes locked on her like a question he already knew the answer to. The air changed. Thicker, warmer, charged. Serafina's breath caught. She had missed the ceremony, but it was the Alpha King who had come. Before we continue, please, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. The scent of pine needles and wet earth clung to the air as Serafina braced both feet against the fallen tree trunk. Her palms, slick with sweat and already scraped raw, pressed harder against the bark. The man beneath the timber coughed, a thin, reedy sound that made her heart lurch. His eyes fluttered, barely conscious. A smear of blood darkened his temple and his chest barely lifted with breath. "Please," she whispered, not to him, not even to the gods, but to the forest itself. Her muscles trembled. Her dress tore further at the hem as she shifted her stance again, trying to wedge her shoulder beneath the trunk's edge. Every time she moved, splinters bit into her skin. Her knees sank deeper into the mud. She pushed. Nothing. The weight refused her. The forest, thick and watching, offered no help. A bird shrieked high above, startled from its perch. Somewhere, far off, the first low beat of a drum reached her ears. Steady, rhythmic, calling. She froze. No. The ceremony. It had started. For a moment, just a breath, her hands loosened. Her mind conjured the image she had clung to for weeks. Herself standing under the lantern light, her hair woven tight and shining, her red gown catching the eye of a potential mate, maybe even someone with a real home, a name worth sharing. She would be seen, chosen, saved. Another cough snapped her back, wet and shallow. She scrambled to the side, palms pressing against the wood again, shoulder wedging in. Her arms screamed. She pushed until her breath came in sobs, until her vision blurred and her ears rang. Her dress split at the seam beneath her arm. Blood welled where bark tore at her knuckles. "You are not dying here," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Not while I'm still breathing." The drums echoed louder now. The sky above the trees darkened slightly as evening descended over the village. Lanterns would be lighting. The crowd would be forming. Names whispered. Eyes scanning. Not hers. Not anymore. The trunk shifted. Just a breath. Just enough for mud to slosh into the new gap. It was enough. She wedged a thick branch beneath the timber, threw her full weight down on the other end, and cried out as it rolled just enough for the man to gasp, cough, and drag in air. She knelt beside him, her chest heaving, His eyelids fluttered open for a heartbeat long enough to see her face. Dirt smeared, braid undone, lips cracked from breathless effort. "Help came," he rasped. "Not quite," she said softly. "But soon." She ripped fabric from the inside of her skirt, wrapped it tight around his wounded leg, careful not to meet his eyes again. If she did, she feared she'd cry. Not for him, but for herself. For the chance slipping further away with every passing second. She ran, through the underbrush, back toward the main path, skidding in mud. Branches clawing at her arms, her satchel slapped against her hip as she sprinted, lungs burning. At the village edge, she caught sight of a young boy, barely old enough for patrol. She didn't stop to explain, just grabbed his arm, breathless, urgent. "A man's trapped, injured, south of the stream bend. Get the healers, now." He blinked, eyes wide at the sight of her. Bloodied, bruised, half wild, but he nodded, ran. She stood there a moment, bent at the waist, clutching her knees, drawing in shaky gulps of air. The drums had stopped. It was over. She turned back toward the trees, her limbs trembling, each step slower than the last. Her legs barely carried her to the place where the man now lay still, eyes closed, breath steadier but shallow. She sat beside him in the growing dark, the fabric of her gown soaked through. Her satchel cradled in her lap like a promise broken. By the time the healers arrived, guided by lanterns and the boy's quick steps, her body had gone numb. They lifted the stranger gently, murmured something about cracked ribs, shallow breathing, infection risk. One of them offered Serafina a hand to stand. She didn't take it. She couldn't. Her hands were a map of raw lines and bruises. Her gown, the one she had poured her heart into, was little more than a ruined scrap hanging off her shoulders. Someone asked her name. She barely heard them. The drums had beaten without her, and she had missed everything. But as she watched them disappear down the trail with the man she had saved, one thought, stubborn and quiet, rose above the ache in her bones. She had chosen right, even if no one saw her, even if no one ever would. The sound of the drums was distant now, but each beat struck like a blow to the chest. They hadn't stopped, not even when the healers arrived, not even when Serafina, soaked in sweat and dirt, staggered back from the clearing and watched them tend to the stranger. The tempo echoed through the forest, steady and ceremonial, an unwavering reminder of everything she'd given up. One of the healers, a woman in gray robes with kind, unreadable eyes, offered her water. Serafina accepted it with trembling fingers. Her hands, now stiff with dried blood and bark fragments, barely worked. She took a sip. It tasted of pine and metal. "He'll live," the healer said softly, nodding toward the man still lying in the grass, now wrapped in a thick woolen blanket. "You kept pressure on his lung long enough. It could have collapsed. Another hour, maybe less, and he'd have drowned in his own breath." Serafina nodded but didn't answer. Her body felt like someone else's, numb, useless. Her gown, the red one she'd poured weeks of quiet hope into, clung to her in tatters. She felt like a ghost of the girl who had stepped onto that path just hours ago, dreams trembling in her chest. The man's eyes flickered open, not all the way, but enough to find her again. "You," he murmured. His voice was dry, cracked, but there was recognition in it, not confusion, not the dazed murmur of someone fading back and forth between consciousness. His gaze pinned her like something important, like he needed to remember her. "You had saved me!" Serafina looked away. She didn't want his gratitude. Not now. Not like this. "I was walking to the ceremony," she said, more to herself than to him. "You cried out." "That's the only reason I came." He smiled weakly, like he'd heard a joke no one else understood. "Still came. Still stayed." One of the younger healers interrupted, tightening a sling across the man's chest and preparing to lift him onto a rough, portable stretcher. Their wagon, parked just up the path, would carry him to a traveling healer camp near the outer woods. They couldn't take Serafina with them, outsiders weren't allowed, but they made promises about updates, that he would recover, that he might even send word. He reached out before they lifted him. His hand found hers, clumsy and shaking. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Serafina." The man's fingers curled slightly, just enough to let her know he'd remember it. "They'll remember you," he whispered. "Even if they don't know why." She didn't reply. The healers lifted him gently, and she stepped back as the wagon creaked away into the trees. Then, silence. No drums now, just the rustle of wind through wet branches and the ache of her own breath. Serafina turned slowly, her steps uneven on the muddy path. Her shoes, ruined from the forest floor, squelched with each step. Her legs ached from hours of kneeling and straining. But she walked anyway, toward the village, toward the firelight flickering at the edge of the clearing, toward the sounds of laughter and celebration still winding down, far too late. The ceremony was over. Couples had been chosen, fate sealed, and she hadn't been there. By the time she passed the first row of thatched homes, eyes had already found her. They didn't speak. Not at first. Just turned, watched, and whispered. Softly at first, then with growing boldness. "There she is. She didn't even show up. Maybe no one invited her. She probably ran off when she realized no one would choose her." Her cheeks burned, but she kept walking. The red gown, soaked and ruined, felt too loud on her skin. The black satchel in her hand, so carefully sewn with neat stitches along the seams, looked childish now, useless. A dream stitched into fabric that had no place in the real world. She passed the village square. Lanterns hung low in the trees, swaying gently with the night breeze. The fire at the center of the circle was down to embers. Music had faded into the hush of paired-off voices, couples drifting back to shared homes, linked by promises made under ceremony. No one looked directly at her, but they saw her. And that was worse. Her breath hitched as she reached the steps of her small cottage, tucked at the far edge of the village. She opened the door with shaking hands and stepped inside. The silence wrapped around her like a too-tight blanket. No one waited for her. No one ever had. She leaned back against the door, sliding down until she sat on the floor, her ruined dress pooling around her like spilled wine. She had saved a life, and no one would care. She had chosen kindness, chosen mercy, chosen someone else's breath over her own belonging, and the cost was everything. But in the hollow stillness of her home, a voice echoed back to her. "They'll remember you, even if they don't know why." She didn't cry. She couldn't. Instead, Serafina reached for a thread on her sleeve and slowly, methodically, began to unpick the torn seam. If she was going to survive being invisible again, she would do it in her own hands. Her heart still trembled, still bruised from what had been lost. But somewhere in the woods, a man was breathing, and that had to be enough. The moon was high by the time Serafina left her cottage again. She hadn't meant to. Her body had begged for rest, and her limbs throbbed with exhaustion. But the quiet inside those four walls had grown too loud. It pressed in around her like judgment, like 1,000 unsaid things. She needed air. She needed to walk. But as soon as she stepped out, she knew it had been a mistake. The village was still alive, not in the celebratory way it had been earlier, but in the slow-burning aftermath of something important. Smoke curling from hearths, couples slipping into doorways, the scent of roasted meat still lingering faintly in the air. Lanterns hung low along the main path, casting flickering shadows that caught her red gown and made it glow like embers with every step. And those steps, they echoed. People turned, not all at once, but in a way that made it clear they'd been waiting, watching, hoping for something to whisper about. There she is. Finally. Some didn't hide their stares. Some didn't bother whispering at all. I thought she'd run off into the woods for good. Missed her big chance. What a shame. Maybe no one asked for her, and she couldn't bear the embarrassment. She was never going to be chosen anyway. Serafina kept walking, her chin high, even if everything inside her begged to crumble. Her hands clenched around her satchel, hiding the raw, broken skin of her fingers. Her dress clung damp to her thighs, and each whisper struck like a lash. She passed the central square again. The fire was out now, just a bed of glowing coals beneath a canopy of smoke. Someone laughed nearby, a low, tipsy laugh that made her stomach turn. A pair of girls leaned against the well, their silver ribbons untied and swinging from their wrists like trophies. One of them looked straight at Serafina. "You missed quite a night," she said, loudly enough to carry. The other girl smirked. "But I suppose you had better things to do." A beat of silence, then laughter. Not cruel, exactly. Just careless, dismissive, as if Serafina were a part of some tired old tale they'd already finished telling. She didn't stop. Not even when she reached the bakery and saw old Rain sweeping out his front stoop, pretending not to notice her until she was just about to pass. "Shame about the ceremony," he said, not looking up. "You'd have made a fine match, if you'd shown up." Serafina paused. Just a second, then she met his eyes. "There was someone dying in the woods," she said. Rain blinked. "Someone trapped. I couldn't just walk away." He straightened, hand still on the broom. "Was it someone important?" he asked, hesitant now. "I didn't ask." And then she walked on. Behind her, silence. She followed the road past the houses and stalls, past the little market square where the musicians had packed away their instruments, where children had danced hours earlier. Her feet dragged, her hands ached, her heart, already battered, now beat with something sharper than shame. It beat with rage. Not loud, not wild. Quiet. Cold. Clean. She had saved a life. With her bare hands, her torn dress, her ruined night, and all the village could see was her absence. Her failure to show up in time to be chosen. Chosen. As if that were all she was good for. As if a life only had value when a man decided to give it one. She reached the edge of the village, where the path narrowed and the lanterns thinned out, and stopped at the old stone bridge. The stream below was dark and fast-moving, swollen from last week's rain. She stood there for a long time, just breathing. She thought of the man's hand around hers, of the way his voice had broken when he said, "You stayed," of how he'd looked at her, not like someone unworthy, not like someone invisible, but like someone real. The ceremony hadn't done that. She had. Serafina closed her eyes. She imagined the drums again, not as they had sounded from far away, mocking and cold, but as they might have sounded if they had beat for her courage, her choice, her bloody hands and shattered dreams. She breathed that image in, held it, and then let it go. When she turned back toward the village, the wind had shifted. It carried whispers, still. It probably always would. But Serafina no longer flinched from them. She was not some story they could laugh about over bread and tea. She was the one who had missed the ceremony for something that mattered more than status, more than ribbons or suitors. And one day, maybe, someone would remember that, not with gossip, but with reverence. As she walked back through the village, slower this time, more eyes followed her, but she didn't look away. Not once. Let them talk. She had her own story now. The fire had burned low in the hall of the northern keep, casting long shadows across stone walls and furred cloaks. A low wind howled through the mountain passes beyond the high windows, but inside, the throne room of the Alpha King was quiet, save for the crackle of embers and the shifting of armor as his guards stood at ease. Zane sat in silence. He hadn't changed since his return from the mating ceremony. The ceremonial braids still hung down his back, loose now, strands slipping free from where they'd been tied with thread dyed in pack colors. A scar, one of many, stood stark against his shoulder where it met his collarbone, the mark from the last border skirmish, not yet healed. But it wasn't pain that held his attention tonight. It was a name he hadn't heard, and a story that wouldn't leave his mind. "They said she never came," the voice beside him repeated. Commander Dren always at his left, always watching. One of the elder sisters from Hollowbrook swore it, claimed the girl was expected, dressed in red, but she vanished before the opening vow. Zane said nothing. He hadn't gone to the ceremony as himself, not in his title, not in his cloak of command. He had watched from the edges, hooded, his scent muted with dried herbs and ash. He hadn't wanted suitors throwing themselves at a throne. He wanted to see the women as they were, when no crown was watching. What he saw had disappointed him. Too many painted smiles. Too many eyes scanning for power. No sincerity, no fire, no truth. He had been about to leave, until the murmurs began. Not from the candidates, from the guards, the healers. The ones who didn't matter enough to be noticed, except by those like him, who knew that true character never walked the center path. A girl in red. "Did you hear? She missed the ceremony." "Why?" "Found some poor soul dying under timber. Didn't even know the man." She stayed, bloodied her hands to drag him free, and then left quietly, as if it hadn't cost her everything. Zane had turned at that. He hadn't meant to, but something in the way the words were spoken, half scorn, half awe, stilled him. "Did you get her name?" he asked, his voice low. Dren frowned. "No. No one seemed to know, but they said she carried a satchel, black, handmade, and her gown was red, torn at the hem. She was seen after, walking through the village, mud-stained, alone." Zane stood slowly. His guards straightened as he moved. Even in silence, his presence commanded the room like a rising storm. He crossed to the long table where scrolls and names from the ceremony lay open. The record of every eligible woman in the surrounding packs, bloodlines, houses, strengths, alliances, all the metrics he had learned to trust, trained to value. He pushed the scroll aside. "This girl," he said quietly, "was not chosen by rank or lineage. She was chosen by what she did when no one was watching." Dren studied him. "You think she's the one?" Zane nodded once. "I don't think, Dren. I know." His tone left no room for argument, but the commander, loyal and sharp-eyed, pressed on. "Even if she's low-ranked? Even if she was mocked?" Zane turned to him slowly. "If compassion is mocked in a kingdom, then it is the kingdom that needs fixing, not the woman." The words hung heavy in the air. "She saved a man she didn't know," Zane said after a moment. "Risked ridicule. Missed her one chance at being seen, and still chose to stay with a stranger. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't make a scene." His eyes narrowed slightly. "She didn't need to." Outside, the wind rose again, fierce and sharp, rattling the shutters like it had heard something it liked. Zane moved to the fire, stared into the coals, and spoke the words aloud as if casting a vow. "She is the kind of mate I've waited for." Dren crossed his arms, thoughtful. "Then what do you want done?" "Nothing formal," Zane said. "Not yet." He reached for his cloak, the dark one without insignia, and pulled it over his broad shoulders. "Just a visit." Dren raised a brow. "Alone?" Zane allowed a rare flicker of a smile. Not soft, something steel-edged. "She won't trust a procession. I want to see her before the village tells her who I am, before they can ruin it." He started for the door, his stride certain. "And if she refuses you?" Dren called after him. Zane paused. "I won't give her commands. I'll offer her a choice, the same one she gave that man in the woods." And then he vanished into the hall, the shadows swallowing his steps. Far below, across the valley, the village slept, but dawn would come quickly. And when it did, Seraphina's world, whether she was ready or not, would never be the same. The sun had barely breached the hills when the first rider appeared at the edge of the village. He came on a black stallion, armor burnished but unmarked, cloak dark and heavy with morning dew. No words, no announcement, just silence and the slow, deliberate pace of someone who did not need to hurry because the world would wait for him. Then came the second rider, then 5 more. By the time the 10th rider crossed the village threshold, the people of Hollowbrook were wide awake and already afraid. Seraphina heard the commotion from her bed. A sharp knocking, no, pounding, on a neighbor's door. A child's cry. The low bark of a command spoken in a voice that carried weight and warning. She sat up slowly, heart pounding. Outside her window, villagers moved in a slow panic, eyes wide, hands gripping shawls and coats. Some whispered, some prayed. A few shut themselves inside without waiting to ask questions. Seraphina stepped out onto her porch just as a guard passed by. He was not from Hollowbrook. That was obvious in the cut of his armor, the mark of the northern wolves pressed into his collar, and the silent, sure way he scanned the cottages without hesitation. She caught his eye. He didn't stop, just nodded once. Dismissive, like she wasn't the one he was looking for. Across the square, old Rain stood half frozen on his stoop, flour on his hands and terror on his face. "It's the Alpha King's guard," he whispered to no one in particular. "They're looking for someone." The baker's wife gasped. "Is it about the border raids? The stolen grain? Did someone anger the crown?" "Maybe someone insulted a noble at the ceremony," another muttered. "They say punishments are worse for offenses done during ritual." Seraphina's blood ran cold. The ceremony. Her absence. She hadn't thought, no, that couldn't be it. Could it? The guards began moving door to door now, knocking sharply, asking names, faces, descriptions. A girl in red, they said, mud-stained, satchel in hand, braided hair, calloused fingers. Seraphina's knees nearly gave out. They were here for her. But not to punish. No, there was no venom in their search, no shouted orders, no threat, just certainty. As if their arrival was not a warning, but a summons. She retreated back into her cottage, heart hammering. The satchel, the black one she had sewn with trembling hope weeks ago, still hung by the door. Her red dress, now folded and stained, sat in the wash basin. She didn't know why her hands shook. She had done nothing wrong. She had saved a life. And yet the knock that came at her door didn't feel like recognition. It felt like judgment. She froze. 3 sharp raps. Not loud, not frantic, but final. When she opened it, she expected another soldier. What she saw instead was a man. Alone. No armor. No heraldry, no guards flanking his sides. Broad-shouldered, bare from the waist up beneath a thick black cloak. His skin was marked with faded scars like strokes of some cruel artist. His hair was dark, braided loosely and falling over one shoulder. He looked like he had stepped out of the wild, power barely leashed beneath calm. And his eyes. They locked on her like he'd found something he hadn't believed was real. Her breath caught. "You're Seraphina," he said. Not a question. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I am." He didn't speak for a long moment, just studied her. Mud-stained dress, bruised hands, eyes wide with uncertainty. And then he stepped forward, slow and sure. "My name is Zane," he said quietly. "You don't know me, but I was at the ceremony." Her heart stopped. "You weren't there," he added, softer now. But I heard the story. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what he wanted. Zane's voice, when it came again, was lower, firmer. You missed the ceremony to save a stranger. It wasn't praise, it was truth. Plain, simple. But the way he said it, like it mattered more than any title or vow, made something crack open in her chest. He stepped back then, giving her space. My guards were looking for you, he said. Because I was looking for you. Serafina swallowed hard, her voice catching. Why? Zane's answer came without hesitation. Because while everyone else came to be chosen, you chose. And then, quietly, I'd like to speak with you. Not a demand, not a royal order, an invitation. The village held its breath around them, ears pressed to doors, hearts pounding with fear, jealousy, awe. But Serafina only nodded. She didn't understand what was happening. But for the first time since the ceremony, someone looked at her like she mattered. And maybe, just maybe, she did. Zane didn't follow her into the house right away. He waited on the threshold, eyes scanning her small, dim cottage with an expression that was unreadable. Neither disdain nor pity, but something sharper, something quiet. Observing. Serafina stepped aside anyway, throat tight. He entered with a kind of restrained power, like every muscle in his body was holding still only because he allowed it. No cloak of royalty, no visible guards, yet he filled the space like thunderclouds filled a sky before a storm. She felt small in his presence, not because he made her feel that way, but because she'd never stood so close to someone who didn't look through her. Zane glanced once around the cottage, neatly kept, modest, nothing grand. A worn chair near the hearth, a basket of mending, herbs hanging dry from the rafters. Her life, in quiet pieces. Then his gaze dropped to her hands. They were still raw, scraped, bruised, dirt in the creases, old blood beneath her nails. And her dress, torn at the sleeve, red fabric dulled by sweat and forest soil. She hadn't changed. He stepped closer. Not too close, but near enough that she could feel the heat of him, the weight of his attention. His eyes, a dark gold touched with something deeper, moved from her face to her arms, then back again. You weren't lying, he said, voice low. She flinched, though he hadn't accused. I didn't think anyone would believe me, she replied. Zane tilted his head slightly. I didn't need to believe you. The truth's written all over you. He reached toward her, paused mid-air, an unspoken question in the gesture. Serafina, stunned by her own boldness, lifted her hand. He took it gently. Not the way people handled something delicate, but with the reverence of someone who knew what it meant to have skin torn in service to others. His thumb brushed one bruised knuckle, slowly, carefully. You dug him out by yourself? He asked. She nodded. There wasn't time to wait. He couldn't breathe. And you missed everything. Another nod. Her voice cracked this time. I meant to go. I did. I was ready. But when I heard him cry out, you turned, Zane finished, when no one else would have. She let her hand fall away, ashamed of the heat rising in her cheeks. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't thinking at all. He stepped back, but not far. You were, he said quietly. You just weren't thinking of yourself. That silenced her, because it was true. And yet, she had. Part of her had mourned every second lost, had counted them in her head even as she fought to free the stranger. Her dreams, her hope for a life beyond the background. She'd watched them slip through her fingers with every broken branch and every hour of silence in the woods. I missed my only chance, she said, voice soft and raw. The ceremony, It was everything, and I ruined it. Zane didn't laugh. He didn't scoff, but his mouth curved, slow and disbelieving. Do you truly think your value lives in a single night? In the judgment of a crowd that wouldn't have noticed you if you'd come in gold instead of red? She blinked, startled. He took another step closer, not touching her, but close enough that his words felt like heat on her skin. I watched dozens of women parade past me with perfect smiles and carefully memorized charms, and none of them, did what you did. I didn't do it for praise, she whispered. I know, he said. That's why it matters. Silence settled between them, heavy and strange. Zane exhaled slowly, then turned slightly toward the window. Light from the rising sun filtered in, casting pale stripes across the floorboards. He seemed older in that moment, not tired, but burdened, as if he carried something too large to speak aloud. I came to the ceremony in disguise, he said, after a long pause. I wanted to see people without the throne between us. And what I saw disappointed me. She didn't answer. What could she say? I was about to leave, he continued, when I heard a healer mention you. No name. Just the girl in red who didn't come. They called you foolish, wasteful, said you'd thrown away your future for a stranger's life. He turned back to her. But to me, you were the only one who showed a future. Her heart thudded once, painfully loud. Zane reached into his coat then, slowly, and pulled something from the inner pocket. A scrap of fabric, red, muddied at the edge, torn in a jagged line. I found this in the clearing, near where the timber fell. She stared at it, at the familiar thread pattern. It had torn when she'd lifted the largest branch. He held it out to her. She took it with both hands, unable to speak. And for the first time, she saw it not as a failure, but as a testament, a mark of where she'd been, what she'd done, who she'd become. I don't want a mate who stands in a circle and waits to be chosen, Zane said quietly. I want one who makes the choice herself. She looked up at him, and saw not the alpha king she'd imagined from stories, cold, towering, unreachable, but a man who had seen her, really seen her, in a way no one else ever had. Seraphina's voice came slow, uncertain. And what if I'm not ready to be anything more than what I am? Zane gave the barest nod. Then I'll wait, he said, because I didn't come here for a title. I came here for you. She stood frozen as he stepped back toward the door, hand resting on the frame. I'll return tomorrow, he said. No crown, no guards, just a conversation. And then, with one last look at her, red dress, raw hands, breath trembling, he stepped out into the dawn. They didn't hold ceremonies at dawn. Not traditionally. The drums didn't sound at sunrise and no lanterns were lit. There were no flower garlands strewn across the village square. No ribbons, no offerings placed on altars. By the time the sun rose over Hollowbrook, the village had already begun to settle into its usual rhythm. Bakers shaping loaves, blacksmiths stoking fires, children running barefoot between stalls. The mating ceremony was over, done. The choices made, the unchosen already returning to their lives with quiet disappointment or bitter resignation. And so, when the Alpha King returned at first light, no one knew what to do. He didn't arrive with fanfare. He didn't arrive with soldiers. Just one horse. One rider. One intent. Zane dismounted at the edge of the square, his cloak catching in the early wind. His hair was freshly tied, the braids neater than the day before. But there was no armor on his chest, no crown on his brow. Just the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need symbols to be known. People gathered fast. They always did when power stepped into their midst. The whispers started like rustling leaves, soft at first, then louder. That's the Alpha King. Why is he here again? Who's he come for? Zane waited until the square was full, until even the children had stopped their games and the shopkeepers had set down their tools. Then he stepped forward, voice low but carrying like thunder. I came here yesterday in search of someone I was told did not belong. Silence. She was not present at the ceremony. She was not dressed in jewels. She did not offer herself for selection. By every custom of our tradition, she forfeited her place. People turned, already knowing who he meant. Serafina stood near the back of the crowd, half hidden behind a barrel of dried flowers. Her heart beat painfully in her chest. Zane's eyes found her. And yet, he said, she passed the only test that ever mattered. He began to walk, not toward the elders, not toward the decorated homes of the high-born girls who had attended the ceremony in silk and song. He walked through the crowd, straight toward her. Serafina could feel every gaze shift as he moved. Shock, disbelief, envy, curiosity. He stopped in front of her, not like a king standing before a subject, but like a man facing something sacred. I saw many women, he said quietly, but only one who made her choice before she knew anyone was watching. Her voice trembled. I didn't do it to be seen. I know, he said. That's why you deserve to be. She tried to look away, but he reached out, not to touch her, not yet, but to offer something. It was the strip of red fabric again, now tied into a clean ribbon, the edge stitched neatly. A symbol not of perfection, but of perseverance. I've chosen you, Serafina, he said, his voice rising just enough to carry. Not for your name, not for your rank, but because you proved yourself in the only way that matters. She shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. But I didn't win anything. I wasn't even there. You were where you were meant to be, he said, and that's all fate ever asks. Behind him, the villagers were silent. They'd never seen a claiming done like this. No rituals, no ceremonies, no declarations from elders. Just two people standing in the middle of a square, one raw from sacrifice, the other choosing her anyway. Zane stepped closer. Voice lowered again, meant only for her. You don't have to say yes. I will not take your future from you. But I won't leave here pretending this choice was never offered. Her throat felt thick. Her hands still scarred. Her body sore in places she hadn't noticed until now. And yet, in his eyes, she didn't see pity. She saw truth, solidity, a future not bought with beauty or politics, but earned. You're not what I imagined, she admitted. He smiled slightly. I hope that's not an insult. No, she said. It's the first good surprise I've had in a long time. She looked down at the ribbon in his hand. She could say no, could turn away, could remain here, mending dresses and gathering herbs and being a shadow. Or she could take the hand of a man who had seen her at her worst and still come back. She reached out, took the ribbon, and nodded. Zane stepped back, turned to the crowd, and raised his voice once more. This is the only ceremony that matters, he said. This choice, this courage, this heart. He didn't ask them to cheer, didn't need their approval. He simply took Serafina's hand in his, and the two of them stood together, mud-stained and radiant, unpolished and undeniable. Slowly, a sound began to build. Not the drums of ritual, but applause. Scattered at first, then stronger. The healer who'd told the tale, the boy who'd run for help. Even the baker, red-faced and humbled, clapped once, twice, then didn't stop. It wasn't unanimous. Some turned away, some sneered, bitter at the broken tradition, at the proof that worthiness could rise from outside their circles. But most stayed, most watched, and in time they would tell this story not with ridicule, but reverence. Not of a girl who missed the mating ceremony, but of the woman who made the right choice instead, and was chosen in return. The wind smelled different from the Alpha King's side, fresher, wilder, like freedom wrapped in pine and sky. Serafina hadn't expected it, that the world itself would feel altered, that the same dirt paths and forest trails she'd walked her whole life would seem reborn now. Not because the land had changed, but because she had. The eyes that once watched her with indifference now turned with something else. Not awe, not fear, recognition. And that was perhaps the strangest part, being seen. Not just in passing, not just as background, but as someone whose choices rippled outward. As someone whose name was now spoken with meaning. It began quietly. First, they called her the one who missed the ceremony. Then, the girl who saved a life. And finally, the Luna in Red. The title caught like a spark. It traveled beyond Hollowbrook, carried by traders, whispered by healers, repeated by warriors at the border. The story grew with every retelling, and while Serafina shrank from some of the embellishments, she hadn't carried the man on her back, hadn't wrestled wolves for space in the clearing. She did not deny the truth at its center. She had chosen someone else's breath over her own reputation, and Zane had seen her for it. The Alpha King kept his word. He did not bind her with a decree. He did not sweep her into court with silks and ceremony and empty speeches. Instead, he visited, he listened, he returned again and again until the rhythm of his presence became something steady, something that made the cottage feel less like a hiding place and more like a beginning. Then, quietly, without fanfare, he asked her to come with him, not as a symbol, not as a prize, but as a partner, and she said yes. The road to the northern keep was long, winding through high passes and deep valleys, where mountain winds howled like wolves and rivers ran dark beneath the pines. She rode beside him, never behind. They spoke little during the ride, but when they did, it was of real things, choices, fears, what it meant to be followed, to lead. At night, by firelight, he'd unwrap his stories like gifts. How he'd nearly walked away from the ceremony in disgust. How he'd once believed strength alone could carry a kingdom. How her absence had been the only presence that mattered. By the time they reached the keep, she understood him more clearly than anyone ever had. And when she stepped through the gates beside him, the guards didn't ask her name. They bowed. The throne room was colder than she'd imagined. Stone floors, tall windows, silence thick enough to hear breath echo. But she walked with her chin high, her torn red dress long since mended but worn proudly beneath her cloak. They didn't hold a second ceremony. There were no drums, no garlands. Zane took her hand in front of the court, raised it in his own, and said, "This is Serafina. She is my mate. She is my Luna. She saved a life, and in doing so, showed me how to live mine." That was all, and it was everything. Life in the northern keep didn't turn her into someone else. She still rose early, still made tea the old way, still stitched her own satchels and rubbed healing salve into her hands when they ached. She did not try to become someone grand. She simply learned to be herself without apology. And slowly, the people around her adjusted. The court began to seek her counsel, not because of her title, but because of her insight. The guards learned to measure her quiet presence the same way they measured storms. Low, steady, impossible to ignore. The younger wolves in training whispered her name with wonder, some hoping to find mates like her, others hoping to become like her. She was still quiet, still soft-spoken, still the woman who had once walked back through Hollowbrook with dirt on her hands and shame in her heart. But now, she was something else too. She was a Luna. Not crowned in gold, but in red, in choice, in fire, in sacrifice. Zane never stopped looking at her the way he had that morning, when she'd stood in the ruins of her gown and held her own name like a shield. He never asked her to change, never tried to mold her into what others expected. And Serafina, once invisible, no longer hid. She walked the stone halls with bare hands and a steady gaze. She spoke with purpose when she chose to, And when she smiled, rarely, but fully, it was like a sunrise after the storm. People said the Alpha King had grown calmer, wiser, more merciful. He told them it was because of her. Because once, a woman missed a ceremony to save a life, and everything after had been a new beginning.